Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 23 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat of mxdwn.com. That's Mixdown. So glad to see you well. Thanks for joining us. We have stories on Michael K. Williams, Coolio, Scott Pilgrim, to a lesser extent, Anamanaguchi, Daft Punk, Spider-Man, and a story about Coachella. First, we're going to start in the world of television, and of course, very, very sadly, in 2021, back on September 6th, Michael K. Williams passed away, and it was revealed shortly thereafter it was a drug overdose, heroin apparently laced with fentanyl, which, as many of you know, is something that is sometimes prescribed legally but is lethally addictive and causes all kinds of massive problems, not the least of which being, of course, overdose and death. Now, what's new news as far as Michael K. Williams passing, Michael K. Williams being an incredible actor who was very, very famous for his part as Omar Little on The Wire, HBO's immaculate masterpiece TV show about the inner cities, inner city Baltimore, and the various trappings of politics, the drug trade, the law enforcement agents, school students, everything, all kind of in one giant mass of people, actors, and brilliant story. But Michael K. Williams having passed away due to this overdose of heroin laced with fentanyl, that apparently one of the four men who had been originally charged with distributing the heroin laced with fentanyl to him has now switched and pled guilty. His name is Irvin Cartagena, and authorities are alleging that he was the one that hand to hand sold the heroin laced with fentanyl to Michael K. Williams. Now, there are three other men charged, and of course, right now there is a different state of play as far as their pleas. But effectively, Irvin Cartagena has changed his plea to plead guilty to the charges. And this is relevant because, coincidentally, in other news that just broke literally in the last 24 hours, one of the earliest shows we had here on This Week is Live focused on how Coolio, the great 90s rapper, had passed away, and it was originally reported as being a cardiac arrest. But news has come out today via TMZ, via Gerald Dosey, who is one of the immediate family members of Coolio, who basically indicated that they had just gotten a toxicology report back and that Coolio had in fact passed away because in his system they found heroin with fentanyl and trace amounts of methamphetamines. Apparently, also, he had lifelong asthma and he had been a cigarette smoker for a long time, and that contributed to his death as well. But, another and entirely not surprising series of how bad fentanyl is affecting America and anyone who comes anywhere near it. And of course, super worse when more hardcore narcotics like heroin or cocaine are being cut with it as well. But another really, really tragic thing in what has become fentanyl's presence in America, whereas 20 years ago wasn't really a thing. And now everywhere you look, you hear horror stories like this all around every world of media and every corner of, everything that we deal with. People, families, people who on some level legitimately are trying to deal with long-term chronic pain, and fentanyl, sometimes different combinations of opioids and things like that are prescribed. So effectively, very, very sad news there. Switching to something a bit happier over in the world of television. Some of you may have been fans or been aware of the movie Scott Pilgrim that Michael Cera starred in, that was adapted from the comic book of the same name, Scott Pilgrim versus the World, and effectively was a kind of a counterculture hit. Wasn't much of a hit as far as its presence in the theaters, didn't do what anyone expected to, had an incredible cast, was really stylized thanks to the director Edgar Wright, and effectively, had an amazing score that a whole bunch of people, not the least of which being Beck, Broken Social Scene, and at least one song from Metric, contributed to make the movie even more authentic and cool. I described it at the time when it came out. It's kind of like the first half of my life stapled to the second half of my life. Equal parts complete nerddom about music and, basically video games. Everything kind of meshed in between those two worlds, and everything in it being a reference to one band or one video game or another. Pretty loving ode to those worlds and the fandom of everything that it was. Well, everyone from that movie has moved on to other things and all kinds of really interesting things in their world and their lives and their careers. And then it was revealed via, the majesty of the internet and Deadline and the Instagram, and from now executive producer Edgar Wright, that basically every single person that was in that movie is coming to reprise their role in a new anime for Netflix. And effectively, it's going to include Michael Cera as the titular Scott Pilgrim and Mary Elizabeth Winstead as his love interest, Ramona Flowers. But also coming back to reprise their roles is Satya Baba, Kieran Culkin, Anna Kendrick, Chris Evans, who played the hilarious but small part of Lucas Lee, Anna Kendrick as Scott's sister Stacy, Allison Pill, Aubrey Plaza playing Julie Powers, who's, I don't know, you have to see it. It fits very well for Aubrey Plaza. Brandon Routh, and then Jason Schwartzman, who is, of course, Gideon Graves, basically the villain. And then, not to be left out, Johnny Simmons, Mark Webber, Mae Whitman, and Ellen Wong. And ostensibly, what else is interesting about this is now when the original movie came out, as I mentioned, the score was done by, various people, including Dan the Automator, and Jason Faulkner did some parts on bass, as well as Justin Meldal Johnson. But then, effectively, also there were songs from Broken Social Scene, and one song at least from Metric that was, of course, pantomimed by Brie Larson in her character as Envy Adams. And then there was also a video game. And the video game featured a totally different soundtrack featuring a band that we've loved at Mixdown for a long time called Anamanaguchi. Now, Anamanaguchi is a kind of a special little thing, as they were a part of that original crop of what was known as chiptune bands. Now, I think Anamanaguchi themselves would probably eschew that label, and there's quite a lot that they do, and there's quite a lot beyond that. But at least in their genesis, they were a corollary thing within that scene. And chiptune basically means, for those that aren't familiar, bands that were using kind of like ancient video game architecture, and they were using that as a mechanism of an instrument to play music, or they were purposely making music that sound like retro video games. It sounded like that was a part of that kind of ethos and the way that video games sounded in the classic original Nintendo NES and Sega Master System era. And effectively, Anamanaguchi is returning to score the show, and they're going to be doing the score, and apparently have contributed a few new songs to it. And look for that coming up on Netflix. No release date as of press time. Elsewhere in the world of music, and interestingly, Daft Punk, who is one of many, many, and now I'm being a little bit more symbolic than literal, but sad casualties of the pandemic in the midst of, all the rest of the horror show that was living through the pandemic. Effectively, Daft Punk announced through a characteristically cryptic video that they were basically breaking up. And essentially it was, like they're walking in the desert, and one of them presses a bunch of buttons on the other one's robot suit, then walks away, and then the one that the buttons pressed on just exploded and just blew up into bits. And then the one who had pressed the buttons just walked off into the distance while, one of their songs from Random Access Memories played, and, basically, a date range of the existence of the band played on the screen. So the band, essentially just disintegrated out of nowhere after many years of not really having done much. I mean, Daft Punk is legendary for having not really been a part of many performances, or even there was the giant controversy at one point where they were supposed to show up on, Stephen Colbert on Comedy Central, when essentially it was the Colbert Report, and they were supposed to make a small, appearance there on that show the summer that, Get Lucky came out, when Random Access Memories came out. And effectively there was like a kerfluffle of sorts that like they had been arranged as an exclusive appearance for the VMAs, MTV's, Video Music Award show. And there was a kind of a weird squabble publicly about that and why they couldn't show up for one as opposed to showing up for all of them. But then, of course, that tracks because effectively that year, when Coachella happened, everyone thought they were going to show up, and that was like the beginning of a couple of years of everyone swearing up and down, oh, Daft Punk's going to play at South by Southwest. Daft Punk's going to play at Austin City Limits. Daft Punk's going to play at Coachella. And of course, they never showed up, and they never played, and nothing was ever really ever announced. But effectively, they made a big splash that year at Coachella when Random Access Memories came out, because a little bit of Get Lucky was played on the video monitors at the main stage of Coachella. Just kind of out of nowhere, just played on the video wall. And then, of course, it became the hit of the summer. But Daft Punk famously, going all the way back to 2006, where the, hadn't played in a long time headliners of the Sahara tent, Depeche Mode was playing at the same time at Coachella, and kind of became the shot heard around the world in the world of music. Like anybody who was there basically walked away from that set freaking out about how good it was. It's one of the few moments in my life where I can say I was there right at that moment. And just, for me, it was kind of a curiosity at that point. I'd always known Daft Punk. I always liked them. And it was like the set of a lifetime. And it basically the next 3 years were just dominated. Any kind of public concert, anywhere you went, you could hear like strains of that influence and how they had kind of affected almost everything that was music, dance music, pop culture music. And of course, anywhere there was a DJ, you could be guaranteed that you've heard at least 2 Daft Punk songs in their set where they were spinning at that particular time. But at any rate, they did a short tour behind that moment, because they were, of course, promoting their like prior year album Human After All at that point when they played at Coachella. So they did a worldwide tour behind that, played a handful of maybe 6 shows in America, and then a bunch of shows around the world, and then that was it. They never did really another show. They did an appearance at the Grammys behind Random Access Memories, where they did kind of like a medley of songs with Nile Rodgers and Stevie Wonder. That's it. They didn't really show up anywhere else. There was one point, I believe, before that where they showed up at the Grammys with Kanye West as a part of his performance of Stronger, and there was like a modified version of the Pyramid. But after that Grammys, appearance of Stevie Wonder, that was basically it. And so there wasn't really any indication given as to why they had split up or why they were calling the band a day, so to speak. But what's interesting and what's newsworthy in this respect is that Toma Bangalter, who was one of the two members, along with Guy Manuel de Hammond Cristo, basically gave an interview with the BBC and somewhat cryptically kind of hinted that the whole spirit of the band was designed to be, how do you use technology and how do you basically express something human through it? It was meant to be like almost like they were humanizing the use of something artificial to express a human conviction and emotion, as opposed to trying to legitimately play a synthetic character, which of course is what was always supposed to be. They were robots from space. And essentially in this interview he indicated Daft Punk was an exploration, I would say, starting with the machine and going away from them. I love technology as a tool, but I'm somehow terrified of the nature of the relationship between the machines and ourselves. He went on to say, we tried to use these machines to express something extremely moving that a machine cannot feel, but a human can. We were always on the side of humanity and not the side of technology. And then he basically also added, the last thing I would want to be in the world we live in 2023 is a robot. Amen to that. And then wrapping up in our story section of the show, we have Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Now, this is just basically that there was a new trailer released, but it was the most footage shown of what the movie and the story is going to look like. And for those of you that are unfamiliar, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which was an animated feature, was the first time that Miles Morales, which is like kind of an alternate reality version of Spider-Man, but now the real continuity version of Spider-Man, and essentially the first time that a black character played Spider-Man. Miles Morales is the main character in this. And then when this particular story was done a few years back, it featured Spider-Mans from other universes. So, of course, there was Spider-Gwen, which is Gwen Stacy, and then the regular Peter Parker Spider-Man. And there was basically a kind of mentor student kind of relationship between, a normal version of Spider-Man, Peter Parker, that we're used to, and Miles Morales. And it was kind of a hinting at, once again, which has become very common in a lot of the Marvel movies, the multiverse, right? Which is basically the concept that there could be numerous realities stacked upon the current reality. And ostensibly, it was a lot of fun. It was a hilarious movie. It was heartwarming. It was cool. And kids all over the country freak out about it. And they love it so much. And it was really well done. And, that kind of rare thing where it was totally kid-friendly, but it wasn't embarrassingly childish or silly. Like adults can totally watch and enjoy Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. So this upcoming sequel, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, kind of is now showing like it's kind of that concept of the multiverse, but on steroids. And they have the character who's played by Shamik Moore entering into, I don't know, kind of a gateway, a matrix, if you will, where pathways of all different realities and different Spider-Mans meet. And, there's some kind of problem, there's some kind of challenge, and somehow the Miles Morales version of Spider-Man runs afoul of what the various Spider-Men are doing, and a lot of the in-jokes and the finger-pointing joke, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I mean. I'm not going to go into that whole meme and everything behind that, but essentially all kind of make an appearance. And most interestingly, of course, Haley Steinfeld returns as Gwen Stacy and Jake Johnson as the Peter Parker Spider-Man, but this one now features Jason Schwartzman. Here he is again, coming off of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World story earlier. But then also, interestingly, Oscar Isaac, who's playing Miguel O'Hara, who comic book fans might remember as being the Spider-Man 2099 version of the character. Yes, there was a continuity within the Marvel Comics where they introduced a whole series of storylines. This was in like the early 90s, called Spider-Man 2099 or X-Men 2099 or Doom 2099 or The Incredible Hulk 2099. So this is a wholly different continuity character. Now, for our story today, since we talked a little bit about Daft Punk, and because next weekend Coachella begins, and for those of you that aren't big music fans, and I thought this would make for a nice counterbalance because we spent so much time in the last couple of shows talking about video games, I thought for the music fans out there would dig a little bit more into music in this particular show. And for those of you that aren't big festival goers, some of you might be like, oh yeah, I've been there, literally got the t-shirt for Coachella, done it a whole bunch of times. But for those of you that aren't super familiar with Coachella, Coachella is an American music festival. I wouldn't call it a rock festival, but a festival, as it were, and has always been a really impressive conflagration of modern popular bands. And in its early years, was kind of modeled after Glastonbury, right? Paul Tillett, one of the founders, and his partner basically went over to Glastonbury at the time that the Prodigy and the Chemical Brothers had become like massive institutions, kind of like what we call the end of the big beat era in what was going on over there in the United Kingdom at the time. And they wanted to bring that to America. So they did the first year here in the Empire Polo Fields in Indio, which is about, I want to say about 2.5 hours east of Los Angeles. It's basically in the desert by the giant windmills and, solar power arrays out way by past Palm Springs and everything. And so essentially at this giant polo fields in what is for them mid-spring, but it still feels like the worst part of the middle of the summer, is essentially this giant field where they'd have a bunch of stages. And the first year they did it, it was bananas lineup. I mean, there was one day where Tool and Rage Against the Machine and Ben Harper all played on the same stage. And then there was another day where it was, basically Morrissey and Beck and Underworld and The Art of Noise and just tons of incredible stuff. They were on hiatus for a couple of years, restarted as one day in 2001, then went back to 2 days in 2002. And then after the legendary 2004 year where the Pixies reunited and then Radiohead headlined, and then also Kraftwerk played, and The Cure and the Flaming Lips right at the apex of the Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots popularity. It became kind of like the buzzword institution. Whatever thunder Glastonbury used to have exclusively worldwide became Coachella's, and then it grew and it grew and it grew. Now, for a lot of years there, it was a lot of what you would call the best of the best of alternative music. It wasn't necessarily heavy music. There would be moments where there'd be heavy music, like the Dillinger Escape Plan played one year, and they were really good. But effectively, it was kind of the greats from all different eras of music. At one point, there would be Public Image Limited playing. And then at another point, there would be, Drive Like Jehu playing. And then, at a different point, you'd have something like The Replacements or, better yet, Throbbing Gristle. One of the final performances that Throbbing Gristle basically ever got to do happened at Coachella. And it wasn't that many people there, but I was there. It was great. And, then things that are more obvious like My Bloody Valentine and, essentially, the kinds of stuff like that was getting popular TV on the radio or the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and, Arcade Fire and stuff like that. And little by little, the festival kind of started to change. Now, I went for a long, long time. It used to be kind of the heartbeat of my year. It used to be like what I would do every single year, no matter what I was doing. I'd make sure that I could be at Coachella, and was life-changing, right? In those years leading up through those festivals, it was one of the best things I'd ever experienced. I was lucky enough to be there the first year when, was Radiohead, the Pixies, Kraftwerk, and then, of course, the one and only time that Josh Homme's The Desert Sessions happened. And one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And then, of course, the next year where Nine Inch Nails had kind of regrouped and Trent Reznor had gotten famously clean and, gotten away from drugs and had kind of like revitalized Nine Inch Nails. I mean, was one of the best concerts I've ever seen in my entire life. And then, of course, 2006, the year right after that, was the legendary Daft Punk performance that I talked about. So for a long time, it went pretty good until somewhere around 2012. There was the year that Muse had their big headlining moment, and it was Muse and Faith No More one night. And then the other night, it was essentially, Gorillaz and, Tom York's what became known as Atoms for Peace. And essentially, that was the year that, did they let too many people in? Did a ton of people break in? I don't know. That's what basically they would say, that there was a lot of people who jumped the line and got in that weren't supposed to. And it was one of those things where, like, I remember being with my now wife at that particular festival, and, we were watching, Passion Pit. Passion Pit had a crowd of something like 60,000 people at least at the outdoor theater stage, which is the side stage. And then all of a sudden, behind us, another band finished, and then you could see a crowd of like several thousand more people come running out of nowhere, to the point that we just scattered and we're like, we got to get out of here. This just isn't safe. And then in the result of that, because that happened, basically the entire dynamic of the festival kind of changed. Things were clamped down. It made it very, very hard for people to be there. You had to be, there wasn't like a guest list kind of thing the way it was. But in the early years, you had to have a legitimate reason to be there. You had to be paying to be there. And of course, the price precipitously went up. And somewhere around this point is also when, because the incredible demand on the festival, they expanded to 2 weekends. And they were the first festival in America that suddenly said, every band that's playing is going to be playing exactly 2 weekends in a row. So any band that's booked for Coachella essentially had to be there 2 weekends in a row. And so that's just kind of madness. I mean, that a festival can draw that many people and, in the upwards of 100,000 plus people, twice. There's that much demand that they can fill all those stages and all those crowds basically twice like that. For me, it was a pretty wonderful thing until it wasn't. And for me, it was because in the beginning, it was all about really cool and exciting music. You know, one year I'd be seeing Massive Attack, another year I'd be seeing, you know, Portishead or Faith No More or Orbital or The Prodigy after a long time of wanting to and not getting a chance to. And that was always the excitement for me. You know, there were years where there were certain things like, say, you know, essentially Blur playing, right? Or the Stone Roses. And there wasn't a ton of people at the main stage because Blur and the Stone Roses, as great and wonderful bands as they are, never really permeated here in America the way that they did across the pond on the other side of the Atlantic. And, you know, you could kind of see that the booking changed, but then you could also kind of see that the audience changed. And whereas it went from being a thing where people just wanted to either see amazing music or just rage and dance and party, which I completely understand, it kind of became the social media generation of people peacocking, coming there to look attractive and to show off fashion and take pictures of themselves. So you found yourself at a point where I remember the last time that I went, I was watching Ryan Adams, and Ryan Adams was playing at the outdoor theater stage, still pretty middle of the day, 3 or 4 o'clock, something like that. It was really, really hot. And essentially, you know, a few hundred people watching Ryan Adams, and then there was several thousand people behind me taking pictures of themselves in front of a giant fake snail, like a snail that was somehow fitted with wheels so that it could roll around the, you know, the grass. And so only a few hundred people were watching Ryan Adams sound brilliant and beautiful and amazing. And then on the other side, there's several thousand people taking selfies. And I mean, I saw example after example of this. I saw Phil Selway from Radiohead play to almost no one. Saw the Replacements playing to a few hundred people. I mean, this is again a crowd of 90 to 110,000 people, and there was like maybe a few hundred people there to see the Replacements. People in Southern California and the punk and hardcore scene will be, you know, abominably angry because there was Drive Like Jehu who had recently united, and they were playing one of the, you know, Gobi tent or one of the Mojave tent, one of the side tents, one of the side stages. There were 3 people, literally 3 people in a sea of 100,000 people. And I remember that there was this day where Off was playing, and this Keith Morris's, you know, band that basically came about in recent years. Keith Morris, famously of Circle Jerks and Black Flag fame, is, you know, pretty wonderful person and a wonderful part of the music scene and has been for a long time. And he was playing the same stage that later Panda Bear would be playing. And I remember Keith Morris basically giving a speech and him essentially saying, you know, that, you know, hey, who here's going to go watch Panda Bear later? Now, if you don't know, Panda Bear is part of Animal Collective, and he's, you know, has his own solo albums and stuff, and it's very, I don't want to say surf inspired, but it's very kind of acid soaked, you know, ethereal music in its own way with his very trademark kind of high register voice. Very interesting stuff, always has been. But essentially, Keith Morris is basically saying on stage, hey, who here, he raises his hand, who here is going to go watch Panda Bear later on the stage? And like nobody raises their hand. And he admonishes the crowd. Now, there isn't a huge crowd there for Off in the middle of all this craziness. But like essentially, he essentially says to the crowd that's there, what are you talking about? Why wouldn't you want to go see Panda Bear? I mean, just because we're like a harder edge punk thing, why wouldn't you want to go expand your mind? And, you know, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially go experience something like that. And that kind of became the big eye-opening moment for me of the whole weekend. When I ended up writing my review of it, I said in no unvarnished terms that you could see that Keith Morris was preaching to the wrong people at the festival, because most people at the festival had already made up their mind. They were very pop culture people. They were there for pop culture things. They weren't really there to see music because they were really big music fans. Maybe they like music, sure, in that very pop culture way, but the worm had turned. Now, a few hours later, Marina and the Diamonds was playing over at the main stage to way more people than the Replacements or, you know, Ryan Adams would have. And how many people watching this even are aware of who Marina and the Diamonds are? They're not terrible for what it's worth. You know, it's a decent band, it's an artist kind of thing, but very, very pop, nowhere near the reputation and legacy of so many other things that weren't playing on the main stage that particular year. And I'm sitting there in the grass, kind of thinking about everything I've seen, and then this gaggle of photographers come running out of the VIP area, and they're frantically taking pictures of someone, and I'm just bored. You know, I wasn't being very interested into Marina and the Diamonds, so I was like, well, what's going on? So I go over there and I go and talk to, you know, I try to talk to the photographers, and I see some girl kind of peacocking and, you know, posing, you know, with whatever she's doing, I don't know. And, you know, I go to try to say, excuse me, what's going on? Who are you taking pictures of? And one person literally, before I even got the sentence done, literally went, "I don't know and I don't care," and then just rudely walked away. And I was like, okay. So then I walked over to another one of the photographers, and the other photographer basically indicated to me, "Oh, it's some reality TV star." Didn't even know who. Didn't know who they were taking pictures of. Didn't know what it was even about, what was going on. Just that's what they were there for. And that was for me the moment where I knew it was like, this isn't really for me anymore. I don't want to sound cheesy or corny or old fuddy-duddy in any way, but it was always about the music for me. I was always there to experience things and to see different things and to have that experience. But by then it changed. And it's been a good number of years since I've gone. And we talked about when the Coachella lineup got announced a couple months ago, how things had kind of changed and essentially, what was different compared to where it stood, in previous years. And also because there's a younger generation now. Bad Bunny might be one of the more popular things out there, and whereas people from older generations might look like, how could anything headline above Gorillaz? But of course, something good. Times change, things change. Bjork isn't headlining the day that she's playing, and that's just getting older. That's just music taste changing as time goes on, and of course where young people's focus is, because a lot of people tend to age out of music. But effectively, it was something that in its time, for my disposition and playing and going and experiencing all this, it was one of the greatest things music had ever had, along with South by Southwest. It was something to be revered, and just it was an amazing experience. So basically, it's a thing that it shows you that it's not impossible. But of course, if you're AG, if you're Anschutz Entertainment Group, and you're Golden Voice, and you're trying to put on something of that magnitude, I mean, you've got to make money. Concert promoting is a very hard business. It's very hard to make money on something like that and to make it, sustainable in a long-term sense. So it is really, really hard to make something like that work. And of course, if you're trying to make something like that work, you got to bring in as many people as possible. You need your Billie Eilishes of the world. You may not always be thinking like, let's get a heritage act like Roger Waters or Guns N' Roses. You might be thinking like, we need Drake, we need The Weeknd. It's a very, very different animal than when it started almost 25 years ago now, 24 years ago. But at any rate, that's all for This Week is Live. We thank you again for so much for joining us this and each week. And for anyone who experiences our content anywhere that you do, whether it's in YouTube Shorts or whether it's on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or any of the places that we share these clips and this show, we thank you for engaging. If you're not already, please subscribe to us here on YouTube. Follow us on Twitch. We air these shows live every week on Thursday, roughly around 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, and then we post the episodes a few days later on YouTube. So if you don't already, please follow us, and we will be back with many more surprises, and we'll be back next week. Thanks again for joining us. So glad to see you well.